Welcome to this week's edition of the Construction CPA's Coffee Cafe. I am the Construction CPA, Lisa Raish. We are dropping the hammer on cash flow problems so you can build things that matter. This week's topic is going to be why job costing basics matter. So this is a continuation of our overall January theme, right? We're cleaning up, we're setting up, and we're getting our job costing foundations in place so we can still have a good, strong year. So let's talk a little bit about job costing, which we do a lot on here, but there are some basic things that we want to make sure that you understand. And again, talk about why this really does matter. Why it matters for your business so that you can kind of get yourself in that right headspace and that right foundational place so that you can build the business that you want. So, what if I actually told you that your profit problems in construction, and this is very specific to construction, come down to just three things: your labor, your materials, and your overhead? And most of you would know that that's actually correct, right? That is the driver of everything in your business, right? So what we're going to talk about today is just keeping your job costing simple. Sometimes it gets very elaborate. There are a number of wonderful tools out there, but it can get very convoluted. And we just want you to break it down into the most simplest form so that you can get the best information out of your financial statements, make better decisions, make better bids on the next project, and so on, right? And so we're going to, we want to break down, why these three basics are so critical, right? Because they're critical to your pricing of your jobs and ultimately your profitability on these projects, right? So again, all right, so why does this matter? Okay. First, your job costing is going to tell you if your jobs actually are making money, right? Very basic. That is simplest form, right? It's not just if you've got cash coming in, right? Are you making money on your projects, right? If you don't understand what the labor is on your projects, the materials, and your overhead, you're going to be guessing on the pricing for that next project and the project after that, and then the project after that. So contractors typically are going to lose money when they're busy because they don't realize that they aren't profitable on the projects. When you're busy, the money's coming in and the money continues to come in, and when the money stops, you realize, oh, we probably weren't as profitable on those projects as we should have been because we probably weren't tracking it correctly. So again, we want to keep it clean. We want it simple. We want your job costing to give you an idea, not only an idea, but control over what it is that you have in your business, right? I don't want you, when you get to the end of a project, to be surprised, right? That look of surprise on a client's face when they realize a project wasn't profitable. We want you to have clarity as you're moving through these projects, right? So that it isn't a surprise for you. We don't want you to overcomplicate these things either, because yes, they can become very, very complicated. You want simplicity and clarity so that you understand what that basic information is and if you are in fact profitable on your projects. Very, very simple, right? So let's talk a little bit more about kind of what our job costing basics are. So what's your first thing? Labor cost, right? So do you have an internal team, right? Do you have your own labor, your own team that are actually going out and working on the projects, right? So that's your field labor. But then you may have a couple of people working in the office. Maybe you've got a project manager who's overseeing the projects, not only out in the field, but in the office, and is following the project along in terms of its pricing and so on, right? What you've spent on it. You want to understand what the difference between those two things are, right? Your field people versus, we'll call them your office or your admin labor. Labor costs are going to be your wages for those individuals, the payroll taxes you're paying for them, workers' comp if you're paying it, any kind of benefits. Are you paying health care? Are you paying a retirement? You matching on a retirement, right? Because if you don't understand what those are and you've underestimated those costs, your labor will kill your profit first and foremost. The others will absolutely if you're off on them, can potentially kill a profit for sure, but being completely off on your labor costs will just destroy any profitability on a project. So you want to make sure that you understand all of the costs associated with that labor, everything that goes into that, not just, oh, it's their hourly wage. No, everything else that goes in there, your payroll taxes, any insurances, benefits, things like that. Okay, so now we've got your material costs. We all know what those are, right? So those are the materials that are directly going to work on that project, right? And so the thing you have to think about also are price fluctuations on your actual materials. And it happens. We've gone through that in the last couple of years where, depending on what's going on in the economy, the prices will spike up and down. It costs a small fortune to get lumber at one point, right? Lumber's come a little bit back down, and now, aluminum became expensive to get, right? So again, do you have price fluctuations? Do you have change orders on your projects, right? So are you actually, or with the customer, making adjustments to the project? So are you considering all of those change orders and the materials in those change orders in your projects? And, you need to track those because, again, just like your labor, it matters. It matters to your overall profitability. Let's talk next about your overhead costs, right? So what is the overhead costs? These are going to be the costs that don't go away. They don't go away regardless if you work or not, right? So those are going to be things like your rent for the office, any of your insurances, your liabilities, your umbrella insurances, the investment for your office staff, the admin staff, the people working, every day on operations, any kind of softwares that you're using in your business, right? That project management software, a lot of those tend to be pretty expensive. And so you want to make sure you're considering all of these expenses when you're ultimately doing your job costing, because they are just as important as the actual materials and the labor on the project. They have an importance in that number, and you cannot leave them out because that will ultimately affect your profitability. So you're not directly assigning those expenses to the jobs, right? There's an allocation that you're like a percentage, right? Let's just say a percentage allocation that you're putting towards those jobs, because that operational cost is required in order to do all of the projects, not just this project here or that project there. So you want to consider them overall when you are figuring out what your costs for the projects are. It's not just the actual materials that got dropped on the job site. It's all of the overhead costs that go into actually managing and monitoring that project. And again, these will also ultimately impact your pricing and what you bid on that next project, because they're important. They're going to be vital in determining whether or not you are truly profitable on these projects. And in the end, how do all of these things work together? It's going to be your labor and your materials are going to be your direct job costs, right? There are 3 team members who went out to this one project site for 3 weeks straight, all of the costs associated with them, their wages, their payroll taxes, their benefits, etc., and then all of the materials that got delivered at the job site, right? That's your direct. You can directly match those up to a project. And then now your overhead needs to be covered by the margins on those projects, right? You need to be profitable on the labor and the materials. You've got to leave some room there, right? Some room there in that sandwich for that overhead in order for you to have some left over to be profitable. Because if one of those items is off, then your profit is going to disappear. If you're off significantly on your labor, forget it. If you're not considering your overhead, you're never going to be profitable on a project. So they're all important together. And as I've mentioned before, keep it simple when you're tracking it. Don't make it convoluted and complex, right? You got to do what works for you. There are some wonderful softwares out there. Again, there are a jillion to choose from, so I'm not going to comment on which one is better or best. Just find the one that's right for you. And you know what? And if you're not doing that, or you're not ready to do that, at least start with basically in an Excel spreadsheet so you at least know what it is costing you for these projects, because you don't want to be surprised when you go to do that next bid that you've actually underbid because you didn't take into account a number of expenses. But you would have learned that if you'd have been job costing on the last 5 or 6 projects that you were doing. So, what are some of the things that you can do today? Kind of these basically these actionable tips and takeaways for you today. First, you need to separate your labor, your materials, and your overhead clearly in your financial statements, right? So, when you're working with it's either your internal person who does your accounting or with the outside firm that does it for you, you've got to make sure that those are clearly designated in your financial statements, right? You want to be clear because it makes it a lot cleaner in the categories and you can start to see what those items are. It's not all bunched together in one line item. Number two, you're going to want to track your labor and your materials by the job. You're not going to lump them all together, right? You've clearly delineated in your financials, your labor, your materials, etc. But now you also want to break those down further into actually by the project so you can look at each one of those by project, right? If you can't see what the actual expenses are, how can you fix that project or the next project or the bidding on the project after that if you don't actually know what you've spent? You need to know what your overhead number is, right? This is going to help protect your margin. So you've got to understand how much on an operation from an operational standpoint it costs you to run your business. All your operational expenses together, again, your rents, your insurances, all the softwares, things like that. Because those items, if you don't consider those in your job costing, are going to chomp away at your margin and probably eat away at it completely so that you show zero profitability. And the fourth thing, keep it simple. Do not overcomplicate it. Simple, consistently tracking it is better than having some convoluted system that nobody ever uses and you can't get any information out of it. So, you know what? If an Excel spreadsheet works for you, then do the Excel spreadsheet. At least that way you've tracked your expenses and you know what you've spent on a project so you can do better next time you bid on that next project. So, in general, you want to make sure that you understand your labor, your materials, your overhead, and you just need to stop guessing as to what all of those are and be able to price or bid on that next project with confidence. It's not, oh, I just made up a number. This is what I'm going to bid out. No, you actually have real data to build your next bid or your quote off of, and it's not just guessing. All right. So, just to generally recap, your job costing basics, right? Very simple. It's going to be better pricing, fewer surprises, and you're going to be more profitable. So next week, what we're going to talk about, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the job costing, but what we want to talk about is actually using the data from that job costing to improve your estimates and your overall margin. All right. So we look forward to seeing you here every week. Follow us here on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We are at the Construction CPA at all. I look forward to seeing you here every week, and I'll see you next week.